New York. Tonight, the Cold War ends where it began. An evening with America's foremost voice on world affairs. The man who crafted détente and opened China. Henry Kissinger on Gorbachev's call for world democracy. And the uncertain order of this brave new world. Now, here's Larry King.
Good evening. We have a real treat in store for you tonight. The Cold War was already pretty much dead, and today it got a decent burial. Presiding Mikhail Gorbachev, who spoke at the Missouri College, where Winston Churchill, 46 years ago, opened an era of political hostility between East and West. Gorbachev, no longer president of anything, called for world democracy and a global security system to prevent new world wars. For the United States, a victory to savor or new responsibilities to worry about. You can tell us any better than Henry Kissinger, the visionary former Secretary of State, who helped Richard Nixon engineer détente with the Soviet Union in the 70s, negotiated to open China and close the Vietnam War. Dr. Kissinger now consults and comments. He's with us here in New York City. Delighted to welcome to our studios, and he'll be with us for the full hour, and we'll be taking your phone calls. Our numbers are 212-643-0077. That's 212-643-0077. Henry, I thank you very much. You said you'd come in 1 hour, and you come through.
Delighted to be here.
Your overall response to the Gorbachev address today?
Well, it's an amazing speech because the historical part is interesting, where he says how weak the Soviets were at the end of the war. But then where he describes the kind of world that he wants to have come about, that sounds like Woodrow Wilson when at the end of World War I.
Yeah. Was that bad?
Well, it isn't bad. It has never worked before. And the idea that all nations of the world could cooperate with each other to preserve the peace is a marvelous and moving idea, except the real challenge to the peace occurs when one major nation doesn't play ball. And then the question is, who cooperates with whom?
So does the pragmatist say it can't work, or does the visionary try to make it work? What do you do if you're in world positions of change?
I think it's a tremendous event when the former head of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union can talk like an American liberal Democrat. I don't mean party Democrat, I mean somebody in the Wilsonian tradition. On the other hand, the problem with the Wilsonian vision was this: if all the nations of the world agree to preserve the peace, then you don't have a problem. But if one or two of the big nations become rogue and aggressors, then all the others will have to choose.
But Wilson's vision allowed for that by having them move against that aggressor, and we didn't go into the League.
Yes, but whenever you take the League of Nations, for example, when Italy attacked Ethiopia, or Abyssinia as it was called in those days, by the rules of the League, all the other nations should have combined against Italy. And they were strong enough to deal with Italy easily without the United States. But then France was worried about Germany. England didn't want a war because they had a strong pacifist tradition.
So self-interest takes over, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and what they were doing then in the 30s was they put sanctions on Italy, except the sanctions that mattered, namely they permitted oil imports into Italy.
What should President Bush say today or tomorrow in response to that Gorbachev address?
Well, what Gorbachev said is in the great American tradition. And he should certainly say that in a world in which all nations are peace-loving, the United States would cooperate with all peace-loving nations. And if they're not peace-loving, we would still cooperate with those nations who want to preserve the peace. So there is an element of realism in the Gorbachev approach, provided a nation like the United States manages to bring together other peace-loving nations, as we did in the Gulf, for example.
Henry, maybe this is simplistic, but everybody wants to live. Is that true? Chinese people don't want to die. Jews don't want to die. Arabs don't want to die. Germans don't want to die. Why do we fight?
Well, it's an interesting question, because you look at human history, you will find practically no period, except for this country, where you can say there's been 100 years of peace. Look at Yugoslavia today. Those people in that region have been killing each other for as long as recorded history. That's where the Ottoman and the Austrian Empire fought, the Roman Empire. And now, and World War I started there.
But you deal with human nature all the time. That's your business, right? Bringing humans together for better nature among themselves. Why?
There seems to be that the ethnic groups and the national groups seem to be in such strong rivalry with each other that they prefer to fight rather than coexist and make some concessions. You see it right now in Bosnia. You see it in the former Soviet Union.
You see it in Los Angeles, too?
And you see it to some extent in Los Angeles, yes.
How does the negotiator, the veteran negotiator such as yourself, whose desire it is to calm it down, right? A negotiator fails if people kill each other.
Exactly.
Okay. What does he do faced with self-interest?
I tell you, the amateurs say, the outsiders say, you tell everybody what he likes to hear, and then sort of sucker them in coming together. That's total nonsense. The thing you have to do if you really want to bring people together is to try to find out what they really want and what the minimum is they can live with, and to try to find out what the other side really wants. Because they're going to meet each other, so you have to tell each of them the same story. What you have to do is convince them that a compromise is better for each of them than what they could gain by conflict.
Then the skilled negotiator doesn't lie.
The skilled negotiator does not lie, because he has to remember that especially the skilled mediator, that the parties will meet each other.
And is all the good ones a win-win?
No agreement will be kept that is not a win-win agreement. If you try to outsmart somebody, you may get the agreement, but it will never be kept.
Right. Gorbachev's role, there's a lot of bases to touch, but what is history? What are they going to say about him?
You know, I've met Gorbachev 7 or 8 times, and I've met previous Soviet leaders. He's livelier, more intellectual. I mean, he has a higher education than the others, and he was much more capable of breaking away from communist ideology than any of the other Soviet leaders. He had tremendous courage in facing the weaknesses of his society and trying to remedy them. What he didn't understand is that the communist system was doomed. He thought he could reform it. And when he started pulling out threads, he unraveled the whole structure. Because after Lenin and Stalin and all the KGB and secret police, the Soviet system had been used to the heavy hand of the central government. And most of the able people were in the Communist Party because that's where the careers were. So he tried to shunt the Communist Party aside. But he didn't create an alternative group of people that were devoted to his view. He thought he could balance between the left and the right, and in the end he had no supporters left, and the left and the right went at each other directly.
If Yeltsin succeeds, does he diminish?
No, he will. You have to remember that Gorbachev has a tremendous reputation in the outside world because he made them safer. Inside Russia, he does not have such a high reputation because many of the Russians liked, or at least were content with the imperial heritage of the past. Yeltsin is a different type. Yeltsin is a more traditional Russian autocratic type than Gorbachev is.
So there'll be 2 history books? The Russian history book will not read the same as the American history book
I think that's
about
right.
Gorbachev.
I think that's right. But I think even in Russia, if Yeltsin succeeds, and if at the end of the day there's a modern state, I think it will be better for Gorbachev than if Yeltsin fails and chaos continues. Because he'll get the credit for having started it anyway.
Lots more to talk about with Henry Kissinger, and your phone calls as well at 212-643-0077. Tomorrow night, David Broder and Bob Woodward and Jerry Seinfeld. And then Friday night, a full hour with Terry Anderson. Don't go away.
Attention inventors. Receive free confidential forms and useful information on how to launch a new product, innovation, or just an idea by calling the Inventors Helpline in Washington, D.C. at 800-227-7000. Call now and you'll also receive a free brochure describing how you can participate in the invention process. Don't wait. Our free Inventors package will get you going in the right direction.
Call 800-227-7000.
When important people have something to say, they say it on CNN. When today's newsmakers have a story to tell, they tell it on CNN. When world leaders have a point to make, they make it on CNN. Get in touch with the people shaping the news. Watch Evans and Novak.
I don't think we'd end up in a civil war, I think.
Newsmaker Saturday.
It was a tough choice. I chose the Indiana National Guard.
Newsmaker Sunday. Every weekend when important people have something to say, they say it on CNN.
We could spend a full evening with Henry Kissinger. We do have an hour. We'll be taking your calls. This is Larry King Live. We're in New York. Where in history does Richard Nixon come into this? The Gorbachev
I think Richard Nixon will be considered the American president of this century, who understood foreign policy best and who started the most initiatives that lasted for a long period of time.
Did Reagan follow suit?
I think Reagan could not have achieved what he did except for the framework that Nixon had originally created in China, relations with the Soviet Union, in the Middle East, in the whole set of negotiations that went on.
Have we seen a resurrection of Richard Nixon, and if so, correctly?
I think Richard Nixon made a lot of mistakes, but he was too harshly treated in '74, and I think he deserves the respect of his country.
By the way, his favorite president was Wilson.
I know.
Interesting how time goes on like this. The Arab-Israeli situation. Query. If President Bush or President Clinton or President Perot or any president said, Henry, be the mediator in this. Take over the our part of Arab-Israeli negotiations. Go there. Would you?
Look, if I were sensible, I wouldn't. And theoretically, I would say no. But if a president asks you to do something and you've been in government, you really shouldn't turn it down. Although, believe me, this is not something I would like to do.
Why? What a crowning cap to a career.
Well, because, for one thing, I don't believe that a final peace settlement is possible. I do believe it's certainly not quickly possible. What I believe is possible is an arrangement on the so-called West Bank in which the Arabs gain a large degree of self-government, all of self-government really, except for the defense of the area, and not of the whole West Bank, but of the non-strategic areas, but 3/4 of the population, plus Gaza. I think that is achievable, and if that could be done, then in 5 or 10 years, if they can learn to live together, and if some of the tension goes out of the relationship, another step could be taken. That, I think, is possible. That would be a tremendous achievement.
Has President Bush called on you for anything?
I have had many opportunities to give my views to President Bush, and he's treated me with great kindness.
So your answer is you wouldn't want to do it, but if asked,
I would
you
not.
say
No,
yes?
I would really want to discourage it strongly and say somebody who has not already been engaged in this. But one should never. It is not right to create the impression that one puts one's personal self-interest ahead of the request of a president.
Someone who does what you do well, what would you look for in a young person?
In what?
A young mediator, negotiator. What do you want? What makes a good one?
Character and courage, and some knowledge of history. It's the only experience we have on which to draw. You can always hire an analyst, but in the difficult decisions, when it's 51-49, you need somebody with character.
We'll be right back with Henry Kissinger. We'll start including your phone calls as well. This is Larry King Live. We'll ask him about the 60 Minutes program. We won't forget that. We'll touch on that. There's a lot of other bases as well. Don't go away.
The legendary Trane Climatough compressor, stout heart of Trane air conditioners.
In a test like this, engineers have been pushing a train compressor to its limits, trying to make it fail. They've been trying and trying for over 20 years. Designed, tested, and manufactured to last. It's hard to stop a train.
Okay, places!
Quite understand.
Quick, hurry up.
All right. How do I look?
Fred! Come on, Olive. Ready?
Ready. Take it from the top.
Okay, boys. A 1, a 2.
Our guest, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, on March 29th on 60 Minutes, they did a piece on you, Henry, a critical, charging, I guess, that you sold influence with world leaders, that your consulting organization makes a great deal of money through your influence. You chose not to appear on that show. So the question is twofold. What did you think of it? Why didn't you appear?
First, let me explain why I didn't appear. And I don't think the average viewer knows how a program like 60 Minutes is put together. They interview you for half an hour. Then they cut up your answers and scatter them throughout the program so that you may be appearing on the program answering a charge which you didn't even hear, in which they fit out of something you have said. And they make you look like a defendant. Charge, answer, charge, answer. They interview you for half an hour. They use maybe 6 or 7 minutes of what you have said. I told them I would appear if they did me either live or taped for a full segment, say 8 minutes or whatever time they wanted from me. Or if they put my questions, they put my answers with the questions rather than just scatter them around. I told them they could take out my whole answer, but that if they cut up my answer, they should indicate to the public that they have cut my answer.
And what
then
did they say?
said, well, they said publicly, I'm trying to control the editing. I wanted them not to edit me. I was perfectly willing to stand on what I had said. What I was not willing to do is for editors of 60 Minutes who are interested in entertainment and sensationalism to make me say things which I hadn't said by taking sentences out of context.
But you and Mike Wallace go back a lot of years. I spoke to Mike. He said he interviewed you 30 years ago.
30 years ago, he interviewed me consecutively for half an hour. I was perfectly willing to do it live on the same terms. I did not want to prescribe to them what they should do. I did not want to have them prescribe to me how they could use answers that I had given in response to totally different questions.
Were you surprised at what they did?
I thought it was savage. I thought it was unfair. I thought it was untrue. Now, again, the average viewer will not believe that you can go for 20 minutes on the top-rated program in the country in which much of what they said was simply untrue, and some of the true things they said were so out of context that they were operationally untrue.
Right. When I retain you, the essence of this story is when I retain you, I'm buying more than just your brains. I'm buying the fact that you get into world leaders no matter what's going on in the world. You get to Beijing if they're killing their people.
First of all, I'm out of government for 15 years. I did not create my consulting firm for 6 years after leaving government for a presidential term and a half. The huge majority of world leaders today are people who were not in office when I was there. I do not peddle influence. One of the things they said was that when I was in China in '89, I did this for business. When I was in China in '89, I was talking to the Chinese about the release of their dissidents, the release of the dissident that was in the American embassy, and I talked about no commercial activity. And what is upsetting to me is that 60 Minutes knew this. They interviewed somebody, Judge Hope, Judith Hope from Washington, a respected lawyer, member of the Harvard Corporation. She told them that she was present at all my meetings, that no business was ever discussed. They did not put her on camera. They did not refer to the fact that they had interviewed her. They put on camera only people who criticized me, most of whom didn't know a thing about what they were saying.
Did you speak to anyone after the show? Did you ask why they didn't include her remarks?
I didn't ask them why. I pointed out to them the many factual errors. I've yet to receive a response. I've sent them 10 pages of errors.
Do you feel personally hurt by Mike?
Yes.
Did you consider him a friend?
I considered him well-disposed. Yes, we go back a long time.
Is public life something that you think, things like this, forgetting truth or not, that people like Henry Kissinger or others are just not going to come forward in the future? It just isn't worth it.
You see, the problem with a program like that is this. One of the reasons they go after somebody like me is because I have public recognition. And they get kudos for bringing somebody down. They get no kudos for praising them. So they interview only people that can spread dirt. And you can appeal to nobody except the conscience of the people who put on the show and who have a vested interest in defending it. And that is not a system that is very desirable.
Do you think that will make talented people, 60 Minutes and others, less likely to want to serve?
Well, if you can be exposed, as I was, after 20 years of opposition to Iraqi radicalism, to the charge that you're promoting business in Iraq, where I have never done any business of any kind, and when they knew this, and never even put on the fact that I had said this to them, then you wonder whether it's worth being in government.
In retrospect, do you think had you submitted to the interview and said what you just said now, they would have run it?
If they had given me the same amount of time as you, for the same interview technique as you, I would have been eager to go on. But what I did not want to do is let them take a snippet out of a long answer and put it up next to a fellow that I didn't know, who was charging me with anything. And given the way electronic works, they can make me look as if I were guilty just by defending myself.
Has it had any post effect, Henry? Have you lost any clients?
I can't tell yet, but it has been very hurtful.
Have you thought of a lawsuit?
Look, Bill Paley, the founder of CBS.
You're on the board of CBS.
I'm on the board of CBS. Bill Paley was one of my closest friends. I'm an executor of his estate. I don't want to hurt CBS. But I also want some rectification and some acknowledgement of the fact that my lawyer sent them memorandum after memorandum to which they did not ever refer except in a 20-second snippet at the end of an 18-minute smear.
We'll come right back with Henry Kissinger. We'll start to include your phone calls for the former Secretary of State. Tomorrow night, David Broder and Bob Woodward and the very funny Jerry Seinfeld. Terry Anderson on Friday. Oliver North returns next Tuesday. How are we doing so far? Don't go away. Welcome back to Larry King Live in New York tonight for a full hour with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. We go to your phone call, San Francisco. Hello.
Hi. Hello, Dr. King. It's a pleasure to speak with you and an honor.
I'm not a doctor. The Kissinger's a doctor. Go ahead.
I understand. It's a wonderful thing to be well thought of in councils of the world, but isn't the real problem in America domestic issues? The problem that we Americans face is the fact that 5 million Americans signed up for first-time unemployment benefits in the last 16 weeks. 5 million Americans are out of work since Christmas.
All right, you don't get asked domestic questions often, Dr. Kissinger, so what's going on in this country?
No, I agree that we have a lot of domestic problems, and I think we have to deal with these domestic problems. We don't have the choice of dealing either with domestic problems or international problems, because, of course, if our economy and social life is terrible, then it doesn't matter so much what we do internationally. But if we are insecure and there's a constant threat of war, it also is very dangerous for our people. So our leadership doesn't have the choice between domestic and foreign policy. They have to do both, and if they can't do both, they'll fail. They'll fail at both.
It's hard, though, to say to the person out of work, let me talk to you about helping Russia.
Very difficult.
No. but still has to be done.
It has to be done. We have to understand why we are helping Russia. And I am not for this unlimited program of aid that some people are talking about. Some humanitarian aid, some technical assistance, I favor.
Wellington, Kansas, for Dr. Henry Kissinger. Hello.
Good evening. Do you think Mikhail Gorbachev could become politically active in the former Soviet Union if he chose to?
I would be very surprised. Within the Soviet Union, his reputation is not as high as it is outside the Soviet Union. Outside the Soviet Union, people remember the peace he brought. Inside the Soviet Union, they think of the disorganization that exists. But it could happen funnily enough, it could happen most likely if there were some sort of authoritarian regime that established itself that then needed somebody to present it to the outside world, and they might ask him then to be president or figurehead president. I'm not sure he would take it, but that is the condition in which he could come back.
So what will he do, write and have a think tank and be an American?
No, I tell you, for people leaving high office, it's a painful transition. And
it's hard not to have power, isn't it?
Well, it isn't so much the power. It's when you are in high office, you know that you're doing something important. And at the end of the day, you want to leave your country better off than you found it. And there's nothing in private life you can do that's as interesting and as fulfilling. So I saw this in Mrs. Thatcher. I saw it in myself many years ago. And especially in a man like Gorbachev, who has been at the head of a very authoritarian system. So I think that he believes that if he can keep himself alive in terms of publicity, that he may be able to come back. But I don't know many people who think that inside the Soviet Union.
Do you miss Henry being in the hunt? In other words, being, instead of, here's the news today, being the maker of the news today?
You have to remember, I'm out of office now for 3 presidential terms. In the first presidential term, in the first 2 years of the Carter administration, it is a transition when you pick up a newspaper and you're used to picking up a telephone and say, do this. And you realize that your phone isn't connected with anybody who can do something about it. But now, and after some time, I understood that from now on, my role in this country is to think of the middle term. If you are in government, you think of the short term and of the tactical, and you're trying to manage day-to-day things. You can never compete, and you should never try to compete with the government from the outside on tactics. What you may be able to do is that remember that the government deals with urgent things, but that some of the long-range things they don't have time for. And that's what I think I can do.
The last time you were with us, you told us that when you dealt with Ross Perot, he drove you crazy on his desire to help people in Vietnam, and he was, he thought it could be done yesterday.
Exactly. And he thought that anything that he considered important should be done by someone, and if that person didn't do it, he would do it.
Are you surprised by his thrust into the American political scene?
Well, I think it has 2 components. One is whatever his personal qualities, which are considerable, but also the fact that I think the public is getting restive with a style of politics which is machine-made, geared to public opinion polls, and so worried about the very immediate impact that they don't know who is taking them from where they are to where they will have to go. And I think the style of our elections is getting to be very demoralizing for dedicated people.
Do you consider him formidable?
Yes.
Will he have a tough time governing if he were president?
I think an almost impossible time. He wouldn't have a party. He wouldn't have any experience in government. He wouldn't know how to deal with the bureaucracy. And as I told you last time, I support President Bush.
Venice, Florida, with Henry Kissinger.
Yes, Mr. Kissinger, do you believe that there are any leaders in this country today of the same caliber, let's say, as our founding fathers? And what do you think the founding fathers would say about where our country is going?
Well, you know, this country has been unbelievably lucky that the greatest people they had, with the exception of Lincoln, were almost all at the beginning. And the early group of of American leaders, it wasn't just one of them, whether it was Washington or Jefferson or Hamilton or Adams or Monroe or Madison, in a small country with, I think, about 5 or 6 million population. It is astounding when you read the Federalist Papers.
Tom Paine, right?
And that's right. And you read the Federalist Papers, you know that our Constitution was an accident. They had thought about it, but they came from rural societies, and they were on their farms. They had winters to read. They weren't driven by television and the evening news.
Polls
and they could reflect about where they wanted to take their country. And they created a country explicitly dedicated to liberty, the first country, the only country that's ever been created for that specific purpose.
Except for Lincoln, all the best were then.
Well, we had some great presidents. I think the two Roosevelts were great presidents. But this concentration of talent at the beginning was extraordinarily fortunate. What would they think today? Well, they would think this is a very busy society, and I think they would say, if you don't know where you're going, every road will get you there. And they'd probably ask us for some road. They'd probably not ask us. They'd probably try to supply some road maps.
We'll be right back with Henry Kissinger on Larry King Live. Don't go away. Our guest is Dr. Henry Kissinger. Going to go right back to the calls. What do you think of this wave now of flying commercial? Jim Baker, they're going to ask him to fly commercial. He's flying commercial.
No, he volunteered to fly commercial.
Would you have? Henry?
No, I didn't.
Would you have?
Would I have? Sure, if necessary. But actually, I don't think it's a great idea, because if the Secretary of State is in some place and there's a crisis, he ought to be able to get back fast. And he ought to be on a plane that has communications. And there's such a thing as overdoing it. The Secretary of State has to work hard enough. And it isn't a question of his comfort. It's a question of being in communication with the government and being able to get back to Washington fast in a crisis.
You've studied this thing. Who's the best we've had? Present company excluded. Who's the Secretary of State's Secretary of State?
Dean Acheson.
We go to Huntington, New York. Hello.
Good evening, Dr. Kissinger. Do you believe that in view of the neo-Nazi movements that are resurging in Germany, could Germany, the United Germanies, ever become a threat to the world again?
I don't think so. I think the neo-Nazi movement is a reaction that you find all over Europe to the migration that is going on in the world today. It's a reaction against foreigners, foreign workers, and it's extremely unpleasant. And I think we're going to see a Germany that is going to be more assertive, because now that they are together, they don't have the need so much to justify their existence. But I do not believe that we will see a militaristic, aggressive Germany again. We may find a Germany that will not be as easy to deal with as in the last 20 years.
Dumont, New Jersey. Hello.
Larry, how are you?
Hi.
Dr. Kissinger, I'd like to ask you a question about the current peace talks going on in Northern Ireland. It seems funny to me that the English government won't talk to the people who are actually doing the fighting. What would you say to that?
What's your assessment of that?
I tell you...
You smiled.
No, I tell you why I smiled. I have an Irish wife, and she has strictly prohibited me from getting myself into the Irish question, because she says the Irish passions are so great that I'm going to get myself into major problems. But
well, we're being watched in both places, England, Ireland. So
I think it's a very tragic situation, and the feelings are so strong on all sides. My impression is, but I'm not all that well informed, they are talking to the Irish government in Dublin. The ones they are not talking to are the IRA, who are blowing them up.
Is that as volatile as Arab-Israeli?
It's as passionate.
Maybe not as worldly important.
It may not be it's as passionate as Arab-Israeli, and maybe more so.
Really? Because it's deep-seated religious as well, right?
Deep-seated religious, and then the presence of the British reduces the incentive for the two Irish parties to get together.
And we generally support Great Britain, right? That's been our position.
We generally oppose what we consider terrorism, and that puts us objectively on the side of Britain.
Did you ever get into it when you were Secretary of State? Beth, you sound like you're relieved you didn't. Beth Page, New York, hello.
Yes, good evening, Larry. Great show, and Dr. Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger, you negotiated for the peace talks in Paris to get our Americans home.
Yes.
You stated that American prisoners of war held in Laos and North Vietnam would be released to us in Hanoi. And there was a statement February 18th to the Washington Post, Pathet Lao says, no truce, no American POWs. This country negotiated away my comrades in arms in Laos, and nobody's ever come home. And I'd like your reaction on that, and also the lifting of the trade embargo.
Well, I think it is possible that, I have no evidence of it, but I do not exclude the fact that in Laos, where things were not extremely well organized, that prisoners were held back in violation of the agreement. And if we ever have any evidence of this, I would be in favor of taking extremely strong action. I'm not in favor of lifting the trade embargo until all our demands and all our uncertainties with respect to the POWs have been lifted, have been removed.
You think there might still be POWs there?
I don't...
Wouldn't they negotiate with us for them?
I cannot see a rational reason why they should hold back POWs without saying they have POWs, because, as you point out, having them would...
if you kidnap, but you don't
they don't do them any good unless they negotiate for them. But then I have to say, I have never dealt with a group of people as treacherous as the North Vietnamese leadership.
Really? Never?
Never. Courageous, heroic, tough, but they would stop at nothing to achieve their objective.
We'll be back with more of Henry Kissinger, more of your phone calls. Tomorrow night, David Broder and Bob Woodward will talk about many things, including Vice President Quayle and the very funny Jerry Seidman. Back after this. Caught up in Dr. Kissinger. I don't know where Jerry Seidman came from, except I think I had a dentist named Jerry Seidman once. It's Jerry Seinfeld, who'll be with us tomorrow night, the very funny Jerry Seinfeld, with Henry Kissinger, Las Vegas. Hello.
Yes, good evening, gentlemen.
Hi.
My question is that with a shrinking globe and increased interdependence between nations, doesn't it make sense to de-emphasize the principles of national sovereignty and try and set up a really strong United Nations with teeth to settle famine, ecological problems, and border conflagrations?
We're one little planet, Henry.
I agree that we should settle environmental questions, conflagrations, and so forth. On the other hand, when you look at the world, if you look at Yugoslavia, you look at some of the former Soviet Union, the fact is that nationalism is growing. Now, it's in many ways irrational, but it has been tied to the human condition. But I agree with the question. For the first time in human history, there are problems that can only be dealt with on a global basis, that cannot be dealt with on a national basis. Ecology, environmental question, global warming, nuclear issues of this nature. And for the first time, you have global communications. For all these reasons, there are new conditions that may enable a more universal approach than we've known in history.
Should the president go to the Rio conference?
He should go to the Rio conference if he has something to say. He should not go to the Rio conference if it's simply for publicity.
West Haven, Connecticut. Hello.
Good evening, Dr. Kissinger. You're wonderful with your knowledge. What would be the first three things you would do to initiate this great country of ours to get back on the track that it should be?
Well,
we gave you the power. Let's say you're... Okay, be king for a minute.
Well, first of all, let me say that this country is not on such a bad track. If you go around other countries and you come here, you can see that this country is still the best country to live in. The people are the kindest people in the world, and that on the whole, we are doing well. We are not doing as well as we want to because of our perfectionism. First thing I think we need to do with respect to our domestic situation is to tell our people that a country that has so many unfulfilled tasks in housing, in schooling, in infrastructure, that such a country has so many things to do together that there's no reason why it should have either a recession or huge division. Secondly, we should face the fact that not every problem can be solved immediately, and our politicians should have the courage to say, to tell the people what really needs to be done in a realistic time frame. And third, and we are doing that we are doing quite well, is to dedicate this country to the global search for peace.
Oh, you're chairman of the World Cup, aren't you?
Absolutely.
The soccer tournament. Yeah, that stands collapse in France. Are you worried about anything when it comes to this country?
No collapsing stands. No, the World Cup will bring 24 soccer teams from various nations, from 24 different nations to the United States. And they'll play for a month, and the final will have the biggest television audience, billions of people.
People get really excited at these games.
Oh, passionate. And it's a great sport.
Give us a favorite? Not your favorite. Who would be favorite to win this?
I think it's too early to tell. I always like to watch Brazil play because they're so elegant. One of the interesting things about soccer is that the national character reflects itself...
In the way they play?
In the way the national team plays. Yes.
No kidding.
I mean, you watch the Brazilians. Yes, you watch the Brazilians, it looks like a samba.
Really?
The Germans do sort of a war plan. Everybody attacks, everybody defends, or everybody defends. Everything you can do with training and preparation, they do. But if they're not ahead in the last 15 minutes, they tend to get a little panicky.
Well, we'll be right back with our remaining moments with Dr. Henry Kissinger after this.
For a transcript of Larry King Live, send $5 to Larry King Live Transcripts, Journal Graphics Incorporated, 1535 Grant Street, Denver, Colorado, 80203. Or call 303-831-9000.
Okay, you got the chance to do weather on television. Is there anything left in the Kissinger career? Anything you'd like to do you haven't done?
Sports.
You want to broadcast a sporting event?
That's right.
A soccer game?
Soccer game or baseball or football game?
Baseball. In other words, if the Mets or CBS or...
I happen to be a Yankee fan.
Turner Broadcasting wanted you to do a Brave game, a Yankee broadcast, if they're watching and they want...
I think after an inning they would get me off.
But you would sit with Rizzuto?
Oh, yeah, I'd have a great time.
Thank you. This was a great hour.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this edition of Larry King Overnight. It is a repeat of Larry King Live. We are with you every night, Monday through Friday at 9 Eastern. And then at 1 a.m. Pacific time, the program is repeated in its entirety. We hope you enjoyed this fascinating hour with an extraordinary man, Dr. Henry Kissinger, former United States Secretary of State. Tomorrow night, David Broder and Bob Woodward discuss the life and times of Vice President Dan Quayle and the very funny Jerry Seinfeld. And then Friday night, Terry Anderson will be with us for a full hour as well. Oliver North returns next week. Thanks for joining us. Have a wonderful Thursday, and good morning.